earlier today, climate change is posing an externality, and so it is quite clear from a policy perspective what we should do, which is usually in the absence of any other externalities or frictions, we should simply impose the Pigouvian tax and internalize it. So that's not a big issue. We also know, and Ottmar has delivered this message very recently, it doesn't cost that much to get rid of the climate externality if we do something about it. Now, we don't see too much of it happening, really, over the last couple of years. And so the question is, why is that the case? And I think this is why political economy comes in. Maybe there are other institutional barriers that we might think about which prevent us from going to this optimal path that we should be going on. So what is the gist of what I want to say? Really is that previous analysis of climate policy, and mostly when I talk about climate policy and models, I mean integrated assessment models, economic integrated assessment models, they really ignore the effect of policy on asset prices. Now, asset prices provide, as I will try to convey to you in the next 15 minutes, a very important mechanism of transferring some of the future benefits that future generations have from climate policy to agents currently alive. So through assets, we can compensate those currently alive and maybe find a way of forming a coalition of people willing to implement climate policy. What did I do? And I will utilize a diamond overlapping generations model rather than the Blanchard-Yari type that we talked about before to investigate how such welfare effects of asset price effects of climate policy play out in an economy that we're studying. And this will allow us not only to study the intertemporal effects, which I would argue you really also can't understand in a Ramsey model, but so not only the intertemporal effects between different generations, but also the intratemporal effects, what is happening at the point of implementation of the policy between different agents, in our case, young and old agents. And I will show you that this leads to the challenge, or this challenges the conventional idea that current agents must sacrifice some of their welfare to the benefit of the future, which is exactly this insight that we heard previously from Sebastian and from Robert on the reasons why we cannot implement climate policy in an OLG framework. Now, what is this conventional view? And I might spend a couple of, or really only a minute or so on this. So the conventional view is really, and I think most of you know this, current efforts improve future stocks of the resource. This creates a benefit to the future. However, doing so implies a cost, and this means that current consumption will go down, and there's a trade-off between current consumption and future consumption, or utility levels, if you wish. And so this is the sacrifice of climate policy, if you want to call it. And this has then led to the level of this focus on optimal abatement levels, on discount rates, because if there's a trade-off, it depends how you discount those future benefits against the current costs that you're incurring, and that, of course, also has important implications for the social cost of carbon or the carbon tax. However, the implicit assumptions that are usually made by these models is that you assume that there's a representative agent at any point in time, which precludes you from thinking about conflict of agents living at this point in time, so you don't really have this political economy richness that you might want to think about. And also, you usually assume that there's an infinitely lived agent, and I would argue that this, again, limits, or you basically exclude the conflict across different points in time with different agents living at different points in time. It's basically the same agent, or if you wish, an OLG economy with perfect request motives, so you really care about the future. But you cannot think about what happens if I completely discount the future, for instance. And so the last point that I would like to raise with the conventional view, or what the standard workhorse models that we use imply, are that you assume implicitly that there are fixed asset prices. So you also exclude the discussion of the effects of policy on asset prices. And this is really because you assume that there's a one-to-one relation between the consumption good and the investment good. And let's say you're in a Ramsey economy, you can basically either consume output or you invest output. And if you then also assume that there's only one good, then you have normalized the price to one because there's only one good. So you also normalize the price of the asset to one. So you cannot have any movements in prices, you only have movements in quantities. And what would the OLG world look like in relation to this? So you still have that environmental policy improves future environmental stocks. However, and I will go into more detail on the next slide on this, you will see that there is some kind of optimal pricing equation. And this optimal pricing equation basically tells you that the asset today, the price of the asset today, should capture these future benefits. So if there's an improvement in the productivity of the asset in the future, this should be reflected in the current price. And as is usually, and as is the convention in overlapping generations models, you usually have that the old generation is owning the asset. So in this case, then the asset owners, the old, will be able to capture and capitalize these benefits in the stock that they're owning today. So while it's still true in our model that environmental policy lowers the current real return to capital because you still have to pay something to do environmental policy, you have an increase in the price of the asset. So there is a difference between the rental rate and the price of the asset. In our model, it's also true that the wage falls, and we can discuss this, this assumption a little bit further if you want in the discussion section. So we basically assume that the cost of policy falls symmetrically on both factors, capital and labor, which is one assumption, but there could be other assumptions. And so this policy is still harming the young. And you also see, to bring in the last picture of welfare analysis, future generations usually benefit from environmental policy. That's the point of why we want to have environmental policy. We want to improve future states of the world, thereby increasing the welfare of future generations. So the only people really losing out in this framework are the current young generation because they live today, and unlike the owners of capital, they only work in one period. So the factor labor is only productive in today's period. It cannot capitalize the future improvements in the environment, and so they are worse off. And so you have this political economy that on the one hand you have the asset owners who are made better off, but on the other hand you have people living today who are worse off, and then you have to think about political processes and decision making, whether or not you want to implement an asset. And I will also talk about this a little bit more in 2 slides. But before doing so, I want to return to this equation that I mentioned. There will be 2 equations in my presentation. The first one is this first order condition on savings decision. And as is usually the case, you want to have that the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the marginal rate of transformation. And so you see here that you have on the left-hand side the marginal rate of substitution for the individual agent, because now we don't have the social planner, but it's the young agent making the decision between investing and consuming, has to equal 1 plus the interest rate, and this is to equal the marginal rate of transformation. And here you see the asset price, right? And so you have the asset price today and the asset price tomorrow. And so what is the basically implied by, or what is this equation telling us? That you give up today in terms of the trade-off that you do in terms of consumption has to be equal to what you spend on the asset when you buy it today and what you get from the asset when you sell it tomorrow. And so you get the return to capital or the rental rate plus what is left over after depreciation times the price of that asset tomorrow. And you can use this, and what you basically get out of this is that the asset price has to equal the present discounted value of future profits, and this is increasing in the resource stock if we assume that there is the standard relation of damages. So if climate change is bad for capital and productivity in the future, then the present value of capital is increasing in the future quality of the environment. And so you can basically, through forward substitution, transfer this equation into this equation, where you see that the price of capital today is the function of future profitability, marginal profitability. So this is basically this mechanism that we identify in our OLG framework, and it helps us to think about asset prices, and it also helps us to think about political economy questions, because now you have this richer set of distributional implications of policy. And now what I'm going to show is some preliminary results that we have been working on in an application to climate change, very similar to what other people have presented today, in the sense that you have an overlapping generation structure. We only have one sector, so we don't have this Leontief structure that we saw before, and you have to make a decision about whether or not you want to abate CO2 emissions. And so what we have to do now is that now you don't have a social planner anymore, so you don't really know how do you come up with policy. Usually with social planner and first best, it's clear you have your objective function, you want to maximize social welfare, but how do you do that if there is an agent today which is benefiting, there's another agent today who's losing out on this, and how do those two come together and agree on what policy level should be set? And we're utilizing a recent framework that has been developed in macroeconomics and most in relation to discussions of the welfare state, which is called probabilistic voting. And it basically says that it's a political economy model, which in the end tells you want to maximize the sum of welfare. So let's say Sebastian is the young agent, I am the old agent, and we choose a decision such that both of us, the sum of our utility or welfare is maximized. And of course, this then also involves the question of timing consistency and commitment that we heard before. And so we also have to take these effects into account. So this is a non-commitment solution because we don't really know, even if the both of us agree on climate policy today, then we don't know what will happen in the future and if in the future this climate policy might be revoked or not. So what I will present you are numerical results for this Markov perfect non-commitment solution and the social planner, if you assume that there was a social planner who would maximize what the social planner usually maximizes. And what you see then is that because of these asset price effects, there is still some positive level of abatement, which is, of course, lower than the social optimum because the social planner also internalizes this intergenerational disconnectedness that you have because there are no, the bequest motives are missing in the overlapping generations framework. So in a sense, the social planner is correcting two externalities, the social externality and the environmental externality. But in the non-commitment solution, you still get a significant and a non-trivial amount of abatement because of the asset price link that I explained before. And so you see, you can transfer then and say, well, what is the implication of these environmental abatement into lifetime welfare of each cohort of agents relative to business as usual. So if it's above 1, it means that you're better off relative to BAU. If it's below 1, you are worse off than BAU. And what you see is if you look at the green line, it's slowly increasing, and so there's no dip. But then if you see in the initial periods, you actually have a sacrifice under the social planner. The social planner goes in too hard and abates emissions too strongly relative for initial generations to benefit. But of course, this is not the case under the Markov perfect voting mechanism. So you again have this relation. On the one hand, you say there's no trade-off. On the other hand, you don't go to the levels that you would want to see under a social optimum. So this is...
Hold on, just to be clear, is abatement 0.2% or 20%?
Oh, so it's 20%. I thought of that, but I hoped you wouldn't notice, but of course you did. So what you see is you have 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, and it's, you go to about 30% under the Markov perfect and above 70% under social planner. And so let me come to my conclusions then. So as I started out with in my presentation, a standard analysis of environmental policy or climate policy implicitly assumes away conflict across agents in the same point in time and assumes a conflict of agents in different points in time. So you have this trade-off and the sacrifice of climate policy, but you usually don't hear people talking about the political economy conflicts at one point in time because you assume a representative agent. However, asset prices matter, and we can use an overlapping generations framework to show that the asset-rich, the old generation, benefits from such policy, and the poor and the young would be harmed by such policy, absolute transfers. However, that despite this conflict, there is the potential of Pareto improvement, and they can strike a bargain through this political economy, the probabilistic voting mechanism that I described before, such that the winners compensate the losers, and then both would benefit. However, this is a can condition, and so we see that this is exactly what I wanted to go to, that there's this political economy argument, and if there are no institutional frictions, then you can reach such a bargain, but the question is, of course, are there such frictions? Are there any barriers that we have to think about in it that would keep us from achieving such a Pareto improvement? And so it would be wrong to think that climate policy will reduce welfare of those alive today when the policy is instituted, provided that you have these transfers that I talked about before. And so I will close with this last comment, and I'll be very interested to hear what the presenters from the previous sessions have to say to my analysis. Thank you.